recording, and we're probably going to have to like make these 30-minute chunks, and we can, I guess, restart twice, and then probably we'll have expanded ourselves. But yeah, go ahead. I think you have the sharing capacities now, if you want to share it.
Okay. So is
yeah, we can see it.
Okay. Okay. So wait, is this? Yeah, this is the beginning. Okay. So as I was just mentioning before, so the main problem with this chapter, which I had, was disentangling like the two, like the historical part or some kind of a conceptual background that Whitehead always tries to include, and his own position. So the conceptual schemas that he's really stands behind or tries to develop. And I think this chapter especially does have this kind of two-parted structure, or at least I try to isolate some of the historical parts in the beginning, and then move to more like substantial philosophical parts in the end. So I think this should help a little bit in trying to understand what he's trying to get at. So yeah, to begin with this historical part, we're simply thrown like into the developments of intellectual developments of the 17th century, how science and philosophy interacted. And Whitehead doesn't really begin with defining the term philosophy; he just starts using it in like a conventional sense. And I think this is very much intentional and even useful, because what Whitehead is trying to say, what he's trying to get across, is that our common conception of philosophy, and even the way we differentiate it from science, is a product of a particular, particularly modern mode of thought. So precisely the kind of the intellectual structure that he's trying to disentangle within this book. So yeah, the main idea is like the encapsulated in this citation, like the origin of modern philosophy is analogous to that of science and is contemporaneous. So what he's trying to say is that science and philosophy, at least in this context, are basically two parts, two aspects of the same process, of the same movement of thought. And not only that, but the chasm between the two is actually indicative of some problematic chasm within this mode of thought as such. So this will be his approach, trying to critique, trying to see what early modern philosophy has to say about this more general style of thought, and to work out a critique through this historical analysis. And this may be an exception to point out is German classical philosophy, and there are of course others to be found, where he simply has no way of really including them into his historical schema. So this is something like we could maybe discuss later. Okay, but to return to his line of thought. So the main characteristic of the 17th century, of the whole, like, let's say, intellectual climate, is this is huge inspiration from classical antiquity. So a kind of break from a medieval theological centered thought. And where the philosophy and science of the early modern period really divide is a question of, on the question of objectivism versus subjectivism. So this is something like where modern philosophy breaks not only from its medieval heritage, but also from classical antiquity. It's like antique philosophy the way Whitehead generalizes it is very much objectivist. It's interested in objective, let's say, third-person phenomena, whereas modern philosophy, that the basic orientation is subjectivist. So before we even get to what this dichotomy really is, the object subject or objectivity subjectivity divide really is about, we could say something about the deeper reasons for this divide, because there is a more fundamental, I think, motivation for why modern philosophy is attracted to the subjective pole. And this is because, as Whitehead says, philosophy is always a rationalist, at least in the sense that rationalism. Well, here actually it gets a little bit strange, because Whitehead says describes this rationality very classically in terms of like rationalists want to get behind the phenomena, want to have some sort of general or universal principles for the unfolding of phenomena. And this is strange because it seems like what this is precisely what science is doing, right? It's also modern science is articulating some general principles behind the flux of nature. And so this is something that was puzzling for me. And the way I try to read this, this is my own interpretation, is that there is a deeper sense of rationalism for Whitehead. Not only is it about universals or laws, but it's about the interrelationship between our most fundamental categories of thought. So for science, a basic characteristic of modern science, what Whitehead says is it's anti-rationalism, is the way it still externally relates the basic categories of, let's say, matter, space, time, and so on. These terms are not really transparent for each other. There is no inherent logic that relates these terms. They're just there, and they seem to be useful for observing phenomena. Whereas for philosophy, wants to have like a single principle which orients the entire conceptual schema which one has. And in this sense, like Whitehead can say that even time, matter, space, and even laws of movement remain stubborn facts for science, for modern science. And in this sense, like this is because the ultimate cause of the divide for Whitehead is that in the 17th century, there began a movement of thought which related scientific objectivity with precisely this kind of external and static relations that science operated with. And it is because of this that philosophy is pushed into a speculation into subjective phraseology, like it has into this domain of subjective individual experience rather than intersubjective reality. Okay, so just to quickly pass over the centuries, like this is something that is characteristic for Whitehead mostly through the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. The most like general or the best way this is exemplified is in Descartes' philosophy, in his dualism of matter and mind as the two basic substances. Of course, we can see why like this. We have matter as science, as naturally science understands it on one side, and the mind as a philosopher, as an epistemologist would approach it on the other. But it is not tied to essentially dualist positions. What is even more characteristic for this intellectual framework is the specific division of labor, which is still not present in Descartes. This is like, and this division is that science studies the material world, whereas philosophy studies the subjective mind. Or we could also say that philosophy becomes specifically specialized in epistemology. So this would be like a line of thought going from Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Kant, and so on. So and even maybe perhaps a more fundamental key to this division of labor is that we have a division between, or I should say, that the physical framework is bound to the objective realm, while the mental vocabulary or the framework of our mental notions of mentality remain bound to the subjective realm. So you could say that physics describe what is in itself and what is intersubjectively given, and psychology and philosophy describe what is for itself and privately given. And this is not a stable position. Like this is, we can see throughout the history of philosophy that this led to all sorts of entanglements. And as Whitehead says, it remains coherent only as long as one limits itself to this artificial partitioning of points of view. And even as such, it remains kind of stuck in this some fundamental aporias. So let me just go through the two fundamental aporias, which are, of course, something we all have encountered before. So this is the first one is like Whitehead says that we experience a seamless interconnection between the mental and the physical aspects of reality. So of course, like we see colored objects and do not start by having these two clear-cut domains of experience, right? And modern methodology, he says, cuts straight across this flux of nature. So we could say we could recognize here like the basic mind-body problem, as it's nowadays phrased. And the second related problem, is that the two terms are not symmetric. So matter is, in some ways, matter is inherent to the mind. If we think of a mind as intentional, as having as being fundamentally about the objects of thought, then matter as that which is thought about is what's the word, becomes inherent to the mind. So it's not something that's external. It's not even something. It doesn't even. It could very well not even be real. So this is like the basic problem of solipsism. So the most fundamental problem of this whole period of thought becomes how a self-enclosed mind comes to know something like an external material reality, or if there even is any such independently objective reality to speak of. Okay, so here I will depart from this historical overview of let's say the problem which is a kind of point of departure for Whitehead, and go into the 20th century solutions. So here, solutions to this problem. So here, Whitehead, of course, also mentions other authors, the most important of which are Bergson and James. But I think most of the arguments proposed in this part of the chapter are actually his own. Someone can correct me on that, but I think this is pretty much his more or less his own original position. So the key problem with the whole framework that was presented earlier has to do with the notion of substance. So here he returns to Descartes and says that the fundamental mistake that Descartes made was to try to formalize thinking beings on the grounds of notions of substantiality, and this. Let me just note this. So this is the substance, and here understood like as that which is in need of nothing beyond itself in order to exist, and on the let's say logical from the logical point of view, it is a carrier of predications. So you can see here, like this is not only you could say the origin of the notion of like a matter in a simple location, but also of a mind as a kind of a self-enclosed or all-encompassing monad, right? So the subject here, if it is interpreted as a kind of a substance, then then the object can only be interpreted as a kind of static determination wholly internal to the subject. So in this sense, the logical conclusion of this framework would be idealism. So the absolutization of subjectivity. And this is again, this is my my addition would be like it would be interesting to discuss some traditions which go beyond or at least escape this kind of this critique. Especially German idealism, of course, isn't really, even in its absolute idealism of Hegel, isn't really bound or isn't I don't think the critique really applies, because the notion of substance is the very object of critique for the, I think, for the whole movement. So yeah, we could maybe discuss this later. But anyway, what is interesting for Whitehead is not just any kind of critique of substantiality, but specifically the one which is which comes to the fore in the 20th century, where the subject-object distinction begins, so to say, to erode from both sides. So in the sense that the science, that the criticism of substantiality comes both from the scientific and philosophical side, and that these two sides themselves become the distinction between the two sides becomes is something to be people strive to abandon this distinction. So the in this respect, physiology is the most important of the disciplines, precisely because we can see that that the distinction between like that the partitioning no longer works. So we are trying to consider the mind as an objective event, and on the other hand, we are trying to see physical occurrences as constitutive of cognition. So in this sense, James is very interesting for Whitehead, because he denies, he starts from these presuppositions, and he arrives at the conclusion that the consciousness isn't a thing or a substance. And the way, but what consciousness actually is, I think, is a wholly Whiteheadian idea here. Or in this chapter, I think there is some confusion, at least for me, whether he is presenting Jamesian position or he is developing his own. But anyway, I think that from here on out, the position is pretty much wholly Whiteheadian. So here the notion, and so the what would be the alternative to seeing consciousness as a thing? He says, like, we could start from from the chemical compositions which make up like a biological organism, and one of the crucial observations is that the parts are in such interrelations as to preserve the whole. So and in this sense, so there is a kind of, there is a whole to be spoken of, independent, or at least something, yeah, that is different from the parts, and that the parts are somehow subordinated to that whole. And cognition here could be interpreted as, here I quote him, as a reflective experience of a totality reporting for itself, for itself what it is in itself as one unit of occurrence. So, and here one could raise the question, this is my question, like why is this not solipsistic? Why are we not back at the solipsistic self-consciousness? And I think he does provide a very good answer, although it is quite entangled and long. But anyway, yeah, it is because the unity, the specific unity of consciousness, as Whitehead sees it, is a unity of an event, of his notion of event, or I could also say it's a unity of principles of organizations, or organization for a stable and enduring pattern. So one could say that the biological organism is constituted from parts, which are, of course, on the first glance, we could say that the constitutive parts of the organism are parts of its body, right? So, and he does say like that the parts of the organism's bodies could be defined as those parts that are especially sensitive to modification of each other and subordinated to the larger, to the organizing of a larger pattern that is the whole body, right? But there's more to this position. Namely, the pattern of the individual body cannot exist outside of the interactions of the patterns of the whole environment. So this is, I think this is what he means by the total bodily event. So like the entire environment of possible interactions for an individual. So in this sense, we could say, I mean, it's obvious what he means. Like any kind of organism has to feed, has to maintain its bodily functions by interacting with all sorts of things, so as not to be in danger or die. And in this sense, the difference between the individual body of the environment and the environment itself is individual body of the organism and the environment is not actually sharply drawn for Whitehead, because all these interactions are what ultimately leads to a stabilization of a pattern that we could identify as an individual organism. So you could say that it is that the distinction between the organism itself and its environment is a matter of a more or less tight-knit, or a degree of tightness of mutual dependence of parts. And this is the ultimate reason why we are able to cognize beyond ourselves. This is like, let me quote him, like, we know ourselves as a function of the unification of a plurality of things other than ourselves. So in this sense, yet there is a kind of individuality of enduring pattern that is your own body, but your consciousness is actually of a unity that that stands for the totality of possible interactions within which this pattern establishes itself as stable, let's say, if that makes any sense. So, yeah, because the total bodily event is relevant for some particular enduring pattern, the pattern is reflected in its environment. And so here I would, I guess, end this discussion of this problem and just add one thing, a thing I found really interesting, like an addition that isn't really explored in the chapter, where he says like the cognition, like we could, I guess his main line of argument is that the cognition could be understood as a prehension of an individual organism or an event so the way an event prehends other events, so a cognizing organism prehends cognitively its environment, right? But there's also a flip side where you could say that cognition also involves being prehended by higher cognitive agents. So this is, I think, implied where he says we can detect in ourselves direct aspects of the mentalities of other organisms. And this is something I think it's quite interesting, but I cannot really grasp it or find any good examples. So maybe this is something we can discuss later. And now let me just quickly recap and pose some questions for the debate. So yeah. Oh, yeah. And the one other thing is, yeah, that we could also start, like, I basically stuck to his notion of physiology and the way he tries to articulate the notion of the organism from the example of the biological sciences, but one could also start from the inanimate nature and the physical approach, which he does, which he also tries to do in the chapter, but that part was especially dense, and I couldn't really grasp what he was trying to say there. So we can return to that in the discussion. But anyway, so I think the basic point of this whole chapter is that thought and matter are better grasped as essential aspects of individual organisms. So they cannot really be they cannot be separated substantially, or even any sort of methodological partitioning leads to an abstraction. So, and this is something like, I mean, it leads to an interesting kind of, one could say, panpsychism, right? So I think this doesn't lead us to the conclusion that, like you said, that an electron literally thinks or is conscious, but I think it does imply that human thought is to be construed as a mode of prehension and the attainment of a stability of a pattern of our own existence. And this is, I think, quite a crucial shift for Whiteheadian epistemology. And from here, I think one can ask all sorts of questions. Like the most general maybe could be like, what are the different kinds of prehension and attainment of stability? Like, I think I don't know if Whitehead ever tried to systematically differentiate between different modes of prehension, but there seems to be a lot to be said for, I don't know. I mean, if you try to, if you are attentive to the similarities between, like, say, the way an electron prehends its environment and the way a human does, I think it would be equally productive to point out the most basic kind of differences, or differences in level or complexity, or anything like that. So, so are there like categories one could point out, like physical, biological, mental, or something like that, kinds of prehension? And then another question I had is, like, do all of them involve some level of reflection? Here, I think he introduces the interesting notion of reflection, of the way the whole is given to itself. And this is something like, I'm interested to know whether this is something he, which is crucial to his framework of events and prehension. Like, are all events somehow given to themselves, or is this something special about the kinds of events that maybe human individuals or cultures have? And lastly, like, a big question concerning, like, a general question regarding science and philosophy would be like, what does this whole story and its conclusion mean for their distinction? I think it isn't really clear whether Whitehead does or even wants to overcome the distinction between the two. So I'll leave it at that, and let's turn to the discussion.
Thank you for the lecture. So I guess we can probably just restart the session because there's like less than a minute left. So see you in like a couple seconds.